to Voices and Words. I'm Todd Duplantis, and we are coming to you from the HCC TV studios. This is a story that talks with authors about their books that they've just released. Joining me now is HCC Professor Dr. Moretta. Welcome to the show.
Thank you, Todd.
You've been with HCC for 35 years. You also teach at U of H, and you specialize in 19th and 20th century.
Correct.
Today we're talking about a book called The Hippies, a 1960s history. And of course, this book gets some relevance nowadays because of not only what's going on in the world, we'll talk about that later,
sure.
but we're kind of at the 50th anniversary of Woodstock with
Correct.
2019,
Right.
and is that bringing a resurgence into this?
I think it's generated a little bit more interest. I've been reading a lot of reviews of the 50th anniversary
Right.
celebration. The majority have been very negative in the sense that there's no way, the consensus kind of is,
Sure.
there's no way you can resurrect that most momentous moment within the 1960s counterculture. In fact, some have been very scathing indictments of even the original progenitors of the festival, like Michael Lang, for example.
Right.
He's been horribly criticized.
And they can't get a permit to hold a 50th.
Yes, and so completely
worked out.
unraveled, fell apart. Most of the original artists have either disbanded or passed away.
Right.
A lot of them showed no interest in doing it.
Right.
For them, that was a once-in-a-lifetime moment. Like you said, the permits.
Yeah.
And people think, a lot of people, it's a misnomer that the festival was not held in Woodstock, it was held in Wallkill.
Right.
Right? On Max
Yasgur's
Yasgur's
farm. Yeah.
dairy farm,
Yeah,
right? And one of the most incredible moments of the whole festival was when Max Yasgur came and spoke to the crowd of 400,000 people and praised them because he was very hesitant.
Right,
to
on
have
having it there.
To have it there. And I mentioned in my book, there was a lot of pressure put on poor Max not to hold it, a lot of protest, death threats, if you will.
Right.
But he persevered.
Well, I want to talk more about Woodstock and another major music festival in just a little while,
Sure.
but I want to get into the book itself
Sure.
And talk about the term hippie. Where did this come from?
Well, there's a lot of controversy, but in my best discernment of where it came from, it actually came from black hipsters in the 1930s. In fact, Malcolm X, of all people, who's an icon, is credited with giving that term because you had, in the 50s, you had the emergence of what Norman Mailer called the white Negro, the future hipster or
Right.
hippie. And they were fascinated with African-American culture, particularly African-American hip culture, subculture. And so a lot of these younger white future hipsters and hippies would migrate into Harlem, right? And they were called hippies as a kind of a derogatory
Right.
term, right? And that kind of stuck over the years. Michael Fallon, a writer for the San Francisco Examiner, not Chronicle, has also been credited with coming up with that term as well.
Well, you mentioned San Francisco, and that's where I wanted to get into Haight-Ashbury emergence. I've been to Haight-Ashbury, had my picture. Haight-Ashbury. Had my. I'm living in Houston, used to the Heights here, but it's Haight-Ashbury, and had my picture taken on that corner.
Oh,
but that's so associated with. Is that where the counterculture movement originated?
Yes, largely because of in San Francisco. San Francisco's always, ever since the 1840s, gold rush, 1840s, 50s, San Francisco, even today, has a reputation of being an iconoclast city, a safe haven for the bohemians, for the renegades and the social outcast. And so if you look at the 50s with the beat generation, the beats like Ginsberg, Kenneth Rex Roth, Gregory Corso, all of those beat literary figures found a welcoming home in North Beach, which is a couple miles, not a couple miles, but several blocks from the Haight.
Right.
When North Beach got too expensive, the remnants of those old beats began to migrate toward the Haight. And so the Haight-Ashbury, which I mentioned in my book, had cheap rents, was also a very welcoming, diverse, multicultural community, mostly Russians, Russian Americans, some Italian Americans, Irish Americans, African Americans.
So it was very diverse in that
very
community
diverse,
too as well.
very diverse. And so that became the next kind of migration of the bohemian set of San Francisco.
And the drug culture in that area, where and how did that spring up? Where did somebody go, let's go out and just take a bunch of LSD and play some music? You know?
Yeah, well, that's kind of, that became the stereotype.
Sure.
But there's no doubt about the hippie counterculture was infused with a very serious drug, not going to say drug problem, but drug usage.
Right.
Right. But you can trace the antecedents of that even back to late 50s, early 60s. You can chase it all the way back to Aldous Huxley, right? And a few of these others who experimented. And when you think of the drug culture, the name that immediately pops in is, of course, is Timothy Leary, who became the greatest disciple and propagator of LSD or hallucinogenic drugs. But at the local level, Leary became very unpopular by the time of, interestingly, by the time of the be-in, which gave the hippie movement in San Francisco, the counterculture, incredible national exposure. Leary was already frowned upon. At the local level, a guy named Owsley was the most serious manufacturer, right, of LSD.
Right.
I mentioned him in my book, and he, God knows how many millions of tabs over the years of LSD this guy produced, and he handed them out for free.
And they were just handing them out,
Yeah, like candy.
Wow.
So, I mean, it's pretty interesting.
I want to get into the music, which I want to go a little bit long on that in a little while.
Of course.
So we're going to go ahead and take a break. I want to come back,
Sure.
talk about Woodstock, another popular music festival,
Sure.
and I want to talk Grateful Dead for a little while as
got
well.
it.
All right. You are watching Voices and Words. The book is called The Hippies. I'm with John Moretta, a University of Houston and HCC professor, the author of this book. We'll be back with more. Welcome back to Voices and Words. I'm Todd Duplantis. This is John Moretta, and this is the book he's authored. It's called The Hippies, 1960s History. And John and I were talking about the term hippie earlier, but I want to get into the music now. It's something that's always fascinated me, because I've always been a fan of 1960s, early 70s, and really altogether that music. But let's talk about how this tied into the music movement, and maybe we'll start off with, we're in San Francisco, Haight-Ashbury, and the Grateful Dead.
Okay. Let me do it this way. Rock and roll, classic traditional rock and roll, pretty much died by the late 50s. Some say Elvis's induction into the Army pretty much eclipsed it, but you still had Buddy Holly and Little Richard, a few others still continuing that sound. And then it dies, and you have what I mentioned in my book, the emergence of the teenage crooners, the Bobbies, the V, the Rydells, like 9 million Bobby Vittons, and female singers like Shelley Fabares and Johnny Angel. And mainstream America, older America, sigh of relief, right? Well, boom, the Beatles, right? Transformational. And I mentioned in my book that the Beatles simply resurrected traditional classic rock and roll from the 50s, okay? And they resurrected it. Big stars in England, brought it to the United States. And I have a quote in my book from John Lennon, who said he found it, he was incredulous that this sound had died in the United States. because the origins of rock and roll are African American.
Sure.
Rhythm and blues.
Absolutely.
Throw in some hillbilly, some bluegrass. It's great. Well, rock and roll became revived by the Beatles, other British bands, and then it lasted, as you marched into the 60s, a new sound emerged, which you want me to address, which was called the San Francisco Sound.
Yeah.
Acid rock. And I mentioned in the chapter on rock and roll that this was fundamentally rock and roll, but it was a different sound. It became a sound that reflected the, quote, emerging drug culture.
Right.
But more important than that, I think, it was a sound that you could only appreciate and listen to in what I refer to in the book as the dance halls. Famous Fillmore West, the Avalon, Chet Helms, right, and Bill Graham, legendary rock promoters, icons, right? And that's where the San Francisco Sound emerged. And of course, still today, one of the most legendary of those, of the San Francisco Sound was the Grateful Dead.
Sure, absolutely. You know, the Grateful Dead, and even today when they tour as the Dead and Company with John Mayer. John Mayer's the lead singer of the Grateful Dead.
Right.
What would Jerry be thinking about that?
He's rolling over his grave.
Exactly.
He's
But
rolling over his grave.
they're selling places
No,
out.
sure.
You've got the old and the young
Yes.
and the new fans and the old
Yes.
fans. It's amazing, and they still put
is.
out great music.
They do.
But you had other bands like the Doors. You had Janis Joplin,
Right.
you know, who was from Texas, not that
Right.
far from here.
Beaumont.
You know, and then bands coming in from overseas, the Rolling Stones. But I guess, was the album that changed it all with the sound Sgt. Pepper?
Well,
Was that the one that kind of threw everybody in a tailspin?
I think so, because the Beatles, even though they kind of disappeared for about a year, produced
Yeah.
nothing after '66. I think Revolver was their last major studio production. If you listen to Rubber Soul and Revolver, you saw signs of a Beatles
Right.
transformation.
Yeah,
And then
yeah.
with Sgt. Pepper's, boom.
They went from pop band to psychedelic band in a couple of albums. Really.
Exactly, and that now made the acid rock psychedelic sound legitimate.
Now, we talked earlier about Woodstock, which is
Sure.
iconic for this era, but there's another festival that you write about in your book that, in your mind, was better than Woodstock.
I think so.
Monterey Pop
Monterey
Festival.
Pop.
Yep.
The template, and I'm still not only because I historically believe it's the template, but because I went to the last day.
Right.
Attended the last day I was in high school in '67. I was a junior, going to be a senior, and my buddies and I just heard about this on the radio, local radio in San Jose.
You remember what you paid for tickets back then?
It was free.
For free?
Well, we snuck in.
You snuck in. Oh, there you go.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Tickets were like $4 or $5, I
Right.
think. But by the last day, and so we went in, got in for free, kind of snuck in. And contrary to popular myth, and I mentioned this in the book as well, it was not a hippie love fest because the hippie movement had just started to come out of its own with the being in January, and this is June of '67 was Monterey.
Right.
So, if you look at Pennebaker's classic film Monterey, right, D.A. Pennebaker, and he pans the audience a lot. Two things that people should notice. Number one, the complete paucity of African Americans, even though the producers like John Phillips and Lou Adler wanted to showcase African American bands
Right.
as well, and straight-looking white kids like me.
Right.
Right? I mean, you could count on your hand how many real hippies you saw. They were there, right? But it was the music. And to me, one of the most riveting performances in Monterey. I mean, Jimi Hendrix's performance is classic.
Sure.
He burns his guitar, The Who. But was Ravi Shankar, of all people.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
He
One
was
of the influencers of the Beatles.
Oh, my God, yes. And he was the only performance that got a standing ovation.
Wow.
Flowers tossed to him. Pete Townsend came out and just paid incredible homage to him. He couldn't believe it. Pete Townsend of The Who, one of the greatest guitar players of all time, this was blown away by Ravi Shankar.
Is it amaze you that 50 years later, some of these bands are still taking the stage? And
Oh,
like the
sure.
Rolling Stones
Oh, yeah.
in their late 70s,
Yeah, my God.
blowing everyone away.
Yes. The Who, too.
Yeah.
All that's left of The Who is Townsend and
You got
Roger
two of them
Daltrey,
left, yeah. And
But
everybody
they-
else's son playing in the
Yeah,
band. Sure.
exactly.
Yeah. Kind of
Yeah.
like the Eagles. Same
Eagles,
thing.
yeah,
Yeah.
with what's his name, Glenn Frey.
You're right.
It's kind of, we'll see what happens. to
Yeah.
Eagles.
But I mean, is it amaze you that you see these bands?
No, not really, because had the Beatles not dissolved, broken up, or whatever term you want to use, they
Right.
probably still would have been performing too, because they love to perform. I mean, in the early years, I mean, by the time they performed at Candlestick Park, they were done. I mean, they were exhausted.
Right.
That's why they kind of disappeared. But I think they maybe even performed. Beach Boys, my God, one of the great bands of the 60s.
Still
Performing, still performing. Mike Love is still out there doing it.
I want to get to another historical event involving music, Altamont. You know, on the opposite end of the peace and love spectrum, and I'm sure you've seen Gimme Shelter, but that moment when you see the man stabbing the other one and Jagger watching that's some of the most gripping film I've ever seen.
Without question. And some people say that Altamont was the coup de grace for the counterculture of the 60s. Not really. It was already in decline by Altamont, right? The Stones made huge mistakes hiring the Hells Angels. What is wrong with you as your security guards? That was completely stupid. But they were told to do that on the advice of the Grateful Dead's manager at the time. And so, and what the Stones had this vision of doing in Altamont was to recreate a Woodstock West.
That was the hope.
That was the hope.
Right.
And it was first of all, the location was just like a desolate, barren wasteland. I describe it as much detail as I possibly could in my book, and you compare it to this bucolic, pastoral environment of
a pasture for cattle.
Exactly. And a perfect bowl for a stage. It was unbelievable, the contrast.
We're going to come back in just a few moments. I want to move on to some major political events and kind of compare things to where we are today. I know there's some still hippies around, and there's some counterculture going on right now, and we're going to dig deeper into that. He's John Moretta. I'm Todd Duplantis. The show is called Voices and Words, and this is the book we're here discussing, The Hippies. Stay with us. We'll be back shortly.
I've seen people's lives change just by attending a class at HCC.
Some of them might not have the financial means to go to a four-year university. That doesn't make them any less quote-unquote smart than the kids who go to a four-year school.
HCC is easy to get to. It's easy to apply and easy to become a part of.
It gave me so much confidence.
Once you finish your 2 years there, you can transition into a four-year university or go into the workforce.
It's affordable, it's accessible, it changes lives.
HCC. So many locations. So little tuition. Register today at hccs.edu/now.
Welcome back to Voices and Words. I'm Todd Duplantis. He's John Moretta, HCC professor and the author of this book, The Hippies, a 1960 history. We're here talking about hippies, counterculture, music festivals, and now we're going to get into some of the major and political events that happened in the 60s. I mean, counterculture, did the war back then start this over the Vietnam War? How much of a big role did that play in this movement?
If you look at the long 60s, as we say in history, you have two movements in that decade that were transformational for American youth. First, civil rights, which creates a political, social conscience among American youth. Actually, I'll go with John Kennedy. Okay, even though Kennedy's record on civil rights was dismal, nonetheless, he's going to light a fire, okay, into American youth of that decade, right? And then the civil rights movement will come along, and then that will energize American youth to be involved in social justice activism, which was and civil rights, without question, was the greatest post-World War II crusade, social reform crusade, without any equivocation there. And then LBJ comes along and passes the Civil Rights Acts of 64 and 65. That momentarily, even though there was still a long way to go, right? It kind of took the wind out of the sails of the civil rights movement as far as accomplishments were concerned. King's still active, still promoting other issues. But then in 65, you have the emergence of black power. And with the emergence of black power led by Stokely Carmichael, eventually that will lead to the formation of the Black Panthers, right? But black power initially will kick out all white activists. So when you look at young white activists of that time period, SDS, Students for Democratic Society, they now have no cause.
Right.
So now they'll gravitate and latch on to another cause, which will be the war.
Sure.
The Vietnam War. And that will re-energize, right, the student movements the youth rebellion of the 60s.
And it was a war that lasted for quite some time. Let's talk about the president. You know, we had LBJ, then we went into the Nixon era.
Yes.
And, you know, that famously went horribly well.
Yes.
Wrong, rather, I
Right.
should say.
Right.
And how did that affect? Was that towards the end of the counterculture movement?
Yeah, by the time you get to 69, 70, the hippie movement, the counterculture is still alive and well, but the hippie movement is starting to wane. As historians, we always tend to automatically fix blame for Vietnam on Johnson. But if you've ever seen that classic documentary, Fog of War, which is a one-on-one
Right.
interview with Robert McNamara, which is fabulous. Several times he not only breaks down and cries because he knows that it was his fault. And he says like 2 or 3 times in that documentary, do not blame Lyndon Johnson. I was the architect of that war, that disaster.
Mm-hmm.
And as Harry Truman said, the buck stops here.
Right.
LBJ gave him the green light. So,
And I mean, realistically, we could go on for half an hour about that war.
Of
You
course.
know, I mean,
Forever.
tragedy for America and really for the world as
For
it
the
is. When did the hippie movement or the counterculture movement officially end? When do you consider
well,
end?
if you look at it, it's still alive and well.
Right.
I mean, you see it, manifestations of it everywhere. You've recreated the great festivals of that era with Burning Man.
Yeah, yeah.
In many ways. Coachella out in Southern California, the Mojave Desert of all
Right.
places, right? So you still have this kind of interesting fascination with the millennials and people say in their 40s, right, 50s, people miss the 60s
Yep.
because of their age. Still a fascination with that. So the counterculture is still alive and well in many aspects. But when does the movement itself kind of die? By the time you get to probably the mid to late 70s, right? The
Right.
communes, I have a whole chapter on communes. The communes are extremely important because, again, we stereotypically associate the communes with the hippies. Well, when you look deeper into the back to the country movement, the commune movement, the communard movement, excuse me, when you look at most of the communes that were started in the late 60s, early 70s, and I mentioned 3 in the book, and only 3, and there is just a multitude of
Right.
them. The original founders of those communes were, quote, hippies, right, who realized they couldn't recreate in an urban environment
What was-
the utopia
yeah.
they had hoped for. In fact, it became a dystopia.
Right.
And so they left, and they moved to the country, Candide, going up the country.
Yeah,
Right?
yeah.
And I mentioned 3 in my book. I mean, like I said, there's a multitude of them. I just picked 3 that were the most diverse and representative, but at the same time different in each other. I mentioned Morning Star, The Farm, and Drop City. And of those 3, The Farm in Tennessee is still alive and well.
Did they morph into, I believe they're doing some delis in the Tennessee area.
Yeah.
They morphed into restaurants.
Yes.
And I believe I've gone to them.
There
yeah.
you go.
Yeah. So
Very good.
that's where they are.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And the founder, a guy named Michael Gaskin from
Right.
San Francisco, fascinating guy. I went into greater depth on The Farm. I wrote an article for the Tennessee Historical Quarterly. It came out about a year ago, and I went into greater depth. And Gaskin is a very fascinating guy. He had a vision and a plan, unlike many of the communards, had a vision and a plan from the very beginning, and thus that's why the
Right.
success still today. It's still alive.
So we want to get to where we are today on the, I know you're about to revise this book and release a new edition maybe in the next year.
Sure.
And the perfect storm of a counterculture movement is kind of springing up, and we've got all the plan out there and the landscape for it. Maybe you can talk about that in this era we're in.
Sure. If you look at the counterculture, we tend to, historically, or no, I shouldn't say historically, in popular history, when you say the counterculture, you resurrect the image of the hippies exclusively.
Right.
As I mentioned in the introduction and weave throughout my book, I try to constantly remind readers that the counterculture was the coalescence of all the different youth affinity groups of the 60s. So you have the hippies, you have the Black Panthers, you have SDS, and others, right? That was the counterculture. And we try to separate these groups out, and you can't because, for example, I'll bring it home to Houston, bring it home to Texas. In Houston, especially in Austin, UT, you had a very unique occurrence there where the political radicals, the activists,
Right.
SDS, UT's SDS, formed a very strong alliance with the local hippie scene, right? I just finished an article that's going to come out in January for the Southwest Historical Quarterly that will focus exclusively on the Austin scene, right? And this did not occur in places like Berkeley or on the coast, I'll just say
Right.
on either coast. But you had this incredible, interesting student movement in the Southwest, in the Midwest called Prairie Power, which is the focus of this article I just wrote. And in places like University of Oklahoma, or on campuses like the University of Oklahoma, on the campus of the University of Houston, most notably UT, which became the center of the Prairie Power movement, you saw this interesting alliance, a very strong alliance between the student radicals and the local hip community, which took place nowhere else but on these select Prairie Power campuses, like
Right.
University of Missouri, Southern Illinois, Oklahoma, U of H, UT, places like this. It's really fascinating because you asked me about the counterculture. One of the more interesting amalgamations that occurred is that you have not only political radicalism, represented by SDS and the student activists, but at UT you also had the inclusion of what we call cultural radicalism,
Right.
represented by the hippies, which on the campus at UT and the University of Houston greatly strengthened the student movement on both of those universities, at both of those universities.
And we see that come into play once again with the administration and, of course, with a lot of things that are happening. John Moretta, the book is called The Hippies, A 1960s History. I appreciate you being here in Voices and Words, and I look forward to getting you back in when the new version of this is out. We're going to chat for another half hour.
Be my pleasure.
John Moretta here to join me. I'm Todd Duplantis. This is Voices and Words from Houston Community College, HCC TV studios. We'll see you next time.